It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Paul Pettitt, professor at the University of Durham, who is, I probably say, an old friend of mine since the early 90s, where we were both at the Cambridge University. This would be enough reason for inviting me, but it's not the very reason. The very reason is that I think Paul is one of the most brilliant minds that UK archaeologists has produced in the last 30 years. And this mind is not only brilliant, but is also encyclopedic, because his research has moved from lithic technology to radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, Paleolithic art, cognitive archaeology, and of course, the evolution and characterization of mortuary practices, which is the topic on which he will entertain us. And I'm sure that there will be interesting debate and comment because we have, as you know, people in our lab who have been working for years on this topic. So, and of course, it's very relevant for our GPR program focusing on tipping point. So really is a central subject. So I really thank you. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us today, and really thank you for joining us and accepting this invitation.
Wow, thank you very much indeed, Francesco. That's, I think, almost certainly the best introduction I've ever had. So the money's in the post, you know, the bribe is on its way to you. I'll just share my screen, get that in order before commencing. So yeah, really, thank you, all of you. These are things I don't, and for me, beginning life working on the middle Paleolithic of Southwest France, Bordeaux is, you know, the institution, the one that housed Francois Borda and many others. So it's a great honor to be talking to you, if only from home here in the UK. But I'm grateful, obviously, for the invitation, but also for giving me this opportunity to think about tipping points from the mortuary point of view. So what I'm going to do is see if we can identify tipping points over the course of the long-term course of hominin evolution. Can you all hear me okay? Just a thumb or two up is up. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to begin in an odd place for a Paleolithic archaeologist and just see if we can characterize the typical ways that we tend to think about death and the dead. And of course, the literature of the Bronze Age, be it Mesopotamia or Egypt, gives us our first indication of the way that humans were thinking about these processes. And I'm going to try to argue that there are characteristics which link Bronze Age modern societies with those way back into the Pleistocene. And I wanted to start with this example, of course, of the epic of Gilgamesh, because of course that's all about death, however fascinating it is. And of course, Gilgamesh is concerned that he is going to die like his friend Enkidu, and the whole epic is Gilgamesh trying to find a way to survive death, not to die, to become immortal. And I've taken this quote from book 9 of the epic. "I'm afraid of death," says Gilgamesh, "and so because I'm afraid of death, I go roaming in the world to find Utanapishta or Utanapishtim, who is the survivor of the flood, who becomes the biblical Noah. And of course, he has survived this natural event that otherwise wipes out humans. So I am afraid of death." And this initially gets us into this cognitive state that humans are in which, of course, we all fear dying, or at least most of us don't really want to die. But it does, in the semantics of this, get us into what we actually mean by being afraid of death. And we can contrast two emotional states that are pertinent to this, both fear on the one hand and anxiety on the other. And fear, of course, is a very transient, brief state, highly emotional, of course, which is elicited in this case by anything that threatens one's life. Whereas anxiety is this very slow, low level or tonic state, which relates far more not to an instantaneous response to a threat, but to predicting threats and preparing to mitigate them. And I'm going to be suggesting that one of the great tipping points that I think we can identify takes us from an essentially animal state of fear, which is transient, occasional, and so on, into a more cultural state of anxiety about death. And what we do, be it Sumerian, Babylonian, or modern human, is that we take our memories of our fears of death and we intellectualize them and preserve them, in this case, in a literary way. So that gives us just a first state, if you like, if we're talking about the cognitive evolution of our understanding of death. But the important thing is, it seems to me at least, from Bronze Age literature, is that it's not the very fact of death, but it's that form of wipes us out completely. In other words, annihilation. So this is in fact what Gilgamesh is worried about, the prospect simply of not existing. So that's ultimately what I would call the cultural ecology of fear that humans have evolved. So from that to another modern example to start us, and this is a word of warning on the way some archaeologists can interpret the burial record. And of course, I'm not going to mention the symbolism word, and I'm not going to be making the equation that as soon as you bury your dead, you are a symbolic animal and you are cognitively modern and all that. These terms that don't really have much sense. But this is one example, not from Agatha Christie's book, but of an individual that was murdered, in other words, died unnaturally and suddenly. And it is activities that take place over the course of 4 hours. So the body is moved into a social core in the center of a social group. One individual begins investigating it, and quite quickly after that individual does, most of the group in the surrounding area join it. And after about a minute, there's some 25 individuals interacting with that corpse and with each other expressing, you know, surprise, curiosity, and so on. And then the process of covering that corpse up with gypsum lumps begins after a little while, and then some individuals begin to take over the role of undertakers, if you like, covering up, bringing lumps of gypsum and placing them on the body, whereas others remain interacting with it, caressing it, inspecting it, and so on. So far over time, the corpse becomes covered up, and some individuals actually take a care to pack down the materials, to consolidate them over, you know, over half an hour of time. And then finally, the gaps, the little cracks in the covering are filled up, and so on. And even the materials are riveted. So this remains stable and lasting, if you like. So one might say, and as some colleagues might say, you know, this is a long planned behaviour with lots of different social roles in it and so on, the use of the landscape, the deliberate burial of the dead in it, and so on. It's got to be cognitively modern. One might assume that there's a symbolic element to it as well. And we can see at least 4 activities here as well. Procurement of materials, deposition of these materials, and so on, and a concern with stability and so on. And of course, you've probably guessed I've been cheating with you there, and I've just changed a little bit of the language here, and I've used the word persons, but of course we're dealing with ants here, and I've just added in red here what I left out deliberately to mislead you. But this is an example of the very widespread act of covering up corpses simply for reasons of chemistry. No one wants a dangerous, rotting corpse to be lying around in the middle of a social area. So that just begins to break down a lot of what, at least in previous decades, archaeologists have taken to reflect sophisticated activity. It doesn't need to be. And quite interestingly, there is something of a history of the development of understanding of ant treatment of the dead. And back in the 1950s and 60s, because ants seemed to remove individuals from the nest and deposit them in specific areas, people even came up with the notion that ants deliberately created cemeteries, and perhaps because they reused these cemeteries, they even worshipped their dead as well. Really quite remarkable. Of course, these weren't cemeteries, they were simply refuse piles away from their realised. But you get how we can play with things that look quite complex when we start breaking them down. And unless we assume ants are cognitively modern, doesn't really lend much sense to the use of those terms. And of course, this all comes down to chemical indicators that, well, in life, chemicals suppress necrophones, and of course, when an individual dies, the suppression ceases, and consequently, there's a chemical clue to get this dangerous corpse outside. Quite interestingly, too, I noticed that some ants begin an unconscious behaviour called digging. They actually start moving their front feet and trying to dig sediment, probably out of concern to transport sediment to the corpse, to hide it as well. And I'm not going to suggest that the origins of burial occur in this digging behaviour, but suffice it to say, this kind of activity is widespread in the animal kingdom. And of course, we can follow that through to, these are examples from studies. In the centre here is a laboratory study where a dead termite was introduced into a termite nest, and over the course of 24 hours, the living termites gradually covered it up. And this is one in an actual nest where bodies have been covered up there as well. And of course, we can follow this chemical and perhaps visual clues through into the mammalian world, where very famously it's often said that that elephants in Africa will recognize the crania and tusks of their dead conspecifics. They do, probably because they pay a lot of attention to tusk shape, of course, because tusks are used in their social negotiations, but it obviously doesn't necessarily imply anything more sophisticated. So the reason why I bring this up is that burial, covering of corpses, or necroclostralization, as biologists call it, should be relatively widespread and shouldn't necessarily surprise us when we find it in various animal communities. So how do we begin with this kind of relatively unconscious behaviour and wind up with all of the weird and wonderful beliefs we have about death, dying, the dead and afterlives that are so universal among humans. And why in particular do our beliefs seem fairly convincing, yet a little counterintuitive? Why are they, to use the term that psychologists use, minimally counterintuitive? And how did we get from necroclosteralization to Gilgamesh and his afterlife over the course of human evolution? And of course, whether that involves tipping points is what I'm going to ask. Now, there are three basic characteristics of death that humans learn throughout childhood, by early childhood, of course, that we all, most of us, I think, would agree with. Death is inevitable. There is no way to escape it. It's universal. It happens to everyone, irrespective of who we are. And also, you can't turn back time. You can't bring back the dead. At least this is the Western scientific set of beliefs. And children by the age of around 3 have quite happily taken on board the idea that death is permanent. Once an individual is gone, they're gone for good, at least in a physical sense. A little time later, between 4 and 7, children understand that death is inevitable. It will occur, and it will occur to everyone as well. There's no getting out of it. And by the age of 10, they understand that death is a biological phenomenon. In other words, it is a product of the breakdown. That breakdown can be both by internal factors, something going wrong internally, or external. And this is quite an important point, that we can socialize the idea that things exterior to the body can bring death about. And that's something I will come on to. And probably last is that really the way that you characterize death is a cessation of your biological functions. Your heart stops pumping blood and oxygen around your body. And it seems to me in all of the accounts that developmental psychologists have undertaken of this, is that children usually describe death as simply a removal of an individual, despite the fact that by 10 years old, they understand that their body has simply stopped working. They don't describe it as such. They describe it as that individual simply being somewhere else. They're not here anymore. They've moved on somewhere else, and so on. And really, as children begin to ask questions of their parents and others about death, and the way that those parents teach them, normally they are trying to convey the idea that, well, it is just a walking away, it is just an absence. So all of this great literary culture we have of our minimally counterintuitive beliefs are ways of describing why individuals aren't in this room, you know, and they're not simply ways of saying, well, they're dead, that's it. They don't think anymore, they don't exist anymore. So as my colleague, David Davis has said, all of our funerary beliefs and practices can really be characterized as strategies against death. In other words, ways to mitigate, to explain against annihilation, that cessation of existence. So this we might expect to be very deep rooted and to have a deep evolutionary past. But how deep, of course, is the question. And I haven't thought about tipping points at all. And I've taken a definition from this ecological publication here. The important point being is that tipping point, or the definition as I take it, the definition of a tipping point marks a one-way transition between two contrasting systems. In other words, an evolution, a change from which there is no going back to something more similar, and so on. And of course, they can occur at different scales within individual communities, within a biological taxon, and so on. So that's just me getting my head around the idea of tipping points. And I'm going to suggest over the course of hominin evolution, there are a number of transitions which were effectively cumulative in nature, but that we can probably recognize two tipping points. In other words, transitions from which there was no going back to a simpler organization of the funerary realm. And two important elements, characteristics of funerary belief, I think we can really trace back way into the Pleistocene and perhaps even further. And that is the relatively large amount of attention that bad deaths actually attract, and also the contradictory beliefs in terms of what the dead do and where they do it, and so on. Now, I'll obviously define what I mean by bad death. All deaths are bad, obviously, for the person who's just died, but there are deaths that some people can see as being relatively good, relatively natural. You know, if a 90-year-old, if the Queen dies, which she obviously just has, we can say, well, she was 96, it's terrible, but that's a good death, she died peacefully, etc., etc. Whereas if a child is murdered, you know, then that clearly is a somewhat bad situation. And we can see this in Mesopotamia, we can see this concept in ancient Egypt, we can obviously see it in the modern world, that societies tend to dichotomize between good or bad deaths. Deaths which are natural, predictable, expected, and so on, after a good life, etc., or those which remove an individual before their time, violently, traumatically, and so on. And the flood really, which becomes the biblical flood, of course, is the grand metaphor for violent deaths, for bad deaths. In this case, the gods deciding they want to get rid of humankind. And the flood was also a way to actually explain why humans only live a certain period of time, why we're not immortal, and so on. Well, we were originally, the gods got fed up of us hanging around and being annoying, so they created the flood, and thereafter, all the humans that came afterwards, of life, and that becomes the more natural kind of thing. And really that encodes this notion that it is natural for people to die, it is inevitable, it's one way, at least in terms of this world, you can't come back in any normal way, and so on. And you know, you have this rather nice netherworld, which seems in Irving Finkel's quite ingenious calculation through the use of specific cuneiform characters, that it's a sort of waiting area, that you die, you go and wait in the afterlife until somebody else dies and you can come back into the world in this sort of what one might call a one out, one in system. So already we're getting into this realm of minimally counterintuitive belief. Just while we're still on it, we can look at some of the typical deaths that result in a ghost roving around. And, you know, Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians lived in houses in which you could literally expect to get up from the sofa and a ghost will be standing right next to you and pop out of the corner, and so on. And this is a list, it's actually a manual for dealing with these irritating ghosts. And as you can see, this is explaining all the forms of death which can actually result in a ghost walking. I don't need to go through them and so on, but I particularly like the slip from a date palm at the bottom. I'll come back to that from a very different context later. But what I think is interesting is all of these examples of Mesopotamian ghosts relate to two types of bad deaths, either individuals which died before their time, or those which have died traumatically, you know, unexpectedly, suddenly, violently, and so on. It encodes that very classic notion that, you know, really you should die peacefully at a decent age and so on. And we can find this right through the classical world into the medieval and so on. And this brings in this notion of the contradictions around supernatural beliefs and beliefs about the dead. So, you know, you have the dead buried in the top there at in Pompeii, yet you put honey and particularly wine down so they can drink. So are they dead, or, you know, in what form are they drinking, and so on. And also we have this example of the sarcophagus of Flavius Agricola here too, who is there drinking wine left by his relatives and so on, yet he's also dead as well. And he says at the bottom, don't forget everyone, when you're passing by my tomb, when death comes, everything will be consumed by earth and fire. But here I am actually drinking in the way I used to in life. It's, you know, part of the conversation about death, and contradiction seems to be an important part of it to get people to discuss, to consider it, and so on. So now we've got the kind of nutty kind of beliefs about death out of the way as a start. We can try to look at how we get from that necroclusterization right through to modern human beliefs, if you like. And at first, the stage we might expect is one in which simple chemical signal bodies. For the course of animal evolution, we would expect for the first time emotions to be expressed about the dead, or the fact that death has occurred and so on, perhaps somewhere in the mammalian group. At some point, as social organization becomes more sophisticated, at least in terms of relationships between individuals, we might expect some kind of influence on treatment of the dead to occur based on how these individuals interacted in life. And then at some point, of course, we might expect the introduction of some beliefs about death, however simple at the start at least, and some cultural mechanism of transmission of these. And then ultimately we might expect these, certainly by the Bronze Age, to have gelled into major belief systems, perhaps overlapping with other religious systems and so on. And I'd certainly expect the chemistry to be shared throughout much of animal life, throughout the Metazoa, and then mammals bringing in various degrees the expression of the emotions into their corpse handling. Primates, probably monkey level primates, not just apes, I would see as reflecting to a degree individual interactions that determine how corpses are treated. And then cultural beliefs I see coming in the Upper Pleistocene. I've used that term deliberately to avoid for now Neanderthals or Homo sapiens, but I'll come back to it. And then this wider cultural ecology of belief, which perhaps is in place in the late Pleistocene. That's the overall scheme of it. But of course, trying sensibly to try to link ants to chimpanzees to upper Paleolithic humans is a shaky task when we have only the material record available to us archaeologists, and where primatologists have, at least until recently, only living communities to watch and make observations on. And we have to remember that much interaction leaves no record, like this chimpanzee mother carrying around the naturally mummified body of her dead infant would of course leave no archaeological record, as indeed most cremation and most burials or most disposals of the dead among human societies, such as this cremation of the dead. After the body is cremated here in Nepal, they are tipped over the edge into the river and disappear forever. And we can assume that almost all humans that ever lived have gone the same way. So it's a bit of a shaky foundation to get us from ants and apes through to the Upper Paleolithic. And we have these severe limitations, but we can, I hope, assume that this concern with removing corpses, covering them up, perhaps recognizing parts of them and so on, goes back to our mammalian roots. These become elaborated socially as social groups, as societies become elaborated themselves among the primates, at least. And of course, we can look at hunter-gatherer beliefs about death in general to make some inferences as to what the cultural end of this might be. So we can expect a very deep antiquity for body treatment, removal, recovery, and this sort of thing. We can express emotions, fear, anger, sorrow. If you want to use the word grief, we would expect that to be certainly among mammals. Birds, at least, seem to be able to express confusion, if that's the right word, around the dead. Crows, for example, highly social birds. Then we might expect at some point what I would call a rationalization phase. In other words, a period in which he has advanced to the point to anticipate death. In other words, that notion that it's inevitable, universal, and so on. And also perhaps we can start thinking about ways to deny it, those strategies against death. In other words, to rationalize that, yeah, all right, we're going to disappear in the form that we're in now, but it's not quite that bad. There is some shady afterlife and so on. And then, of course, we might expect it to be blended into wider belief systems, culturalized ever more complexly, and so on too. So that's a framework. And the point of me showing this is that we should always expect more sophisticated behavior way back than, you know, one sudden turning on of the lights somewhere in the Upper Paleolithic or something like that. And normally we underestimate abilities, at least in these very broad ways. At some point, of course, a symbolic element will come into it, but it's remarkable actually how much chimpanzees can do in and with and around the dead that doesn't seem to have any particular symbolic aspect to it as well. So I'm going to try to avoid this, you know, just is it or is it not symbolic? You know, shoving a body in a shallow grave could be extremely symbolic. It could be non-symbolic as well. For me, it's not worth asking this question. And this is the primatologist Jim Anderson, who's observed this great amount of variability in the way that chimpanzees do relate to their dead without any of these symbolic areas. The best account by a primatologist of the death and subsequent mortuary activity of a chimpanzee comes from the Birch's volume on the Thai forest behavior. This is, you can see their photograph here. This is Tina. She was an adolescent, a low-ranking chimpanzee, and the group were walking along. She was at the rear of it and was ambushed by a leopard, killed very quickly. The leopard went off. And then we had, if I remember correctly, 16 hours of activities by the entire group, about 20 individuals, in and around Tina's death site. And I won't go through it in detail, but you have clearly indicators that the chimpanzees are aware that something bad has happened, that Tina has died. They try to investigate the corpse to find out why she's not opening her eyes and lifting her arms and so on. Some of them sit down in silence. They seem to be trying to process the information. A number of them use calls, which are very uncommon in other walks of life. It could be specific expressions of grief, confusion, whatever, or at least they're not ubiquitous, normal, common calls. And there's a lot of what I would call social theatre. In other words, lots of displays, lots of guarding of the corpse, to use the Birch's term. Only high-ranking individuals are allowed access to Tina's corpse and so on. So lots of really sophisticated, lots of complex behaviour. And this must surely represent a baseline of what we might expect, not just for hominin evolution, but for primate evolution in general, at least ape evolution as well. So this gives us a face-to-face glimpse of the sorts of behaviours that we might expect our Miocene ancestors, Pliocene ancestors have indulged in. Can't demonstrate that, of course, but it seems to me fairly sensible. And core to this is the investigation of the corpse, probably, you know, not only for working out whether that individual is really dead or not, lifting the arm and dropping it and so on, but also for the expression of the emotions as well. Sometimes individuals, chimpanzees elsewhere, can they can exhibit a lot of tender care, head, this kind of thing, can jump up and down on the corpse. It's as if they go through this cycle of expressing anger on the one hand and grief on the other as well. So a lot of activity that occurs face to face in the here and now, individual to individual, and represents the social context of the living and the dead there too. And of course, carrying the dead around, at least dead infants by their mothers, is found in a number of chimpanzee communities, not all. So it's tempting to think that this is a culturally variable behaviour in no different a way as nutcracking and so on. Some groups carry their dead infants. The longest recognised, I think, is over 90 days now too. And this is when these infants are a nuisance. You know, that the mother is usually carrying them with one hand, something she's never had to do whilst they've been living, you know, so she has to be careful when climbing and so on. And sometimes they come to be used as social aids as well. They're swung around the head in social displays and this kind of thing too. So they become almost an adjunct, a social adjunct to their mother as well. So again, when we're talking about curation of things as being modern behaviourally, we have to remember this kind of background as well. So it seems to me that if we can talk about transitions throughout this long-term evolution in terms of being a tipping point, the big one would be when something that's more characteristically ape-like, chimpanzee-like, monkey-like, face-to-face, actually becomes something more human-like. In other words, when for the first time, hominins begin to incorporate aspects of the landscape, of place, so from face-to-face to place, into formal burial rites, however simple they are. And this is where I'm trying to suggest a way that tipping point could come and why the tipping point comes about. Now, what I've done here is I've taken the 6 examples that we have, or at least the 6 reliable and well-reported examples of how individuals, chimpanzee individuals, died and what the activities were around their bodies in the minutes and hours that followed their deaths. I appreciate it's only 6. So this is something I hope that as further discoveries are made, further observations are made, it will be falsifiable, and it maybe I'm talking absolute nonsense, but I know for now we can't rule this out. So what I've done is taken these 6 examples and I've plotted them first on the x-axis in terms of how many individuals of the living remaining individuals of their social group are directly involved in activities focused on that corpse and nothing else. You know, they're doing it, all those sorts of things we've just seen, with a specific intent to focus on an expression about that death and so on. So you see up to about 18 individuals. This is pretty much the entire members of the group there. And then I've plotted that against the y-axis, which is the amount of minutes in which those social groups were doing nothing except focusing on the death and the dead. And as you can see, it goes up in Tina's case to over 400 minutes, something like 6 hours. So the first thing I'd note is that, very broadly speaking, the more individuals that are involved in focusing on the corpse, expressing views, if you like, about the corpse and interacting it, the more of those, the greater the amount of time that group spends focusing solely on the death, rather than going away, eating, copulating, you know, exploring, and so on. So we might expect a broad relation between the two. The larger the number of individuals involved in a death, as it were, the longer the period of time spent on dealing with it. But also we can look at the causes of their death. And you see I've put in blue here, some of these are infants who died after a period of illness. Now, that was fairly obvious to them. In the case of Pansy down there at the bottom, quite nicely, Pansy was looked after by her mother, who was very careful to place her down very gently and not sit on her and all this. As soon as Pansy died, she threw her over her shoulder like a sack of potatoes and so on. So quite a very abrupt understanding that Pansy had died. But anyway, you can see some of these deaths were to an extent predictable. They were becoming slow, they had obvious signs of the illness, and then they eventually just stopped. Whereas the others, you can see in red, are those which are sudden and unexpected, either in the case of Tina, I've mentioned, through leopard ambush or falling from trees, not date palm trees here, but at least deaths from trees whilst foraging. So it seems to me quite interesting that, with the possible exception of Malaika, those chimpanzees who die suddenly without prediction and so on, in other words, are bad deaths, tend to attract more interest out of more numbers of people, and they spend longer working it through. I said people, they're chimpanzees. They spend longer working it through. So we might predict from this that when you do have sudden deaths, they occasion more mortuary behaviour, more interest, however face-to-face, and so on. So at the other end of the scheme, we can look at, if we can make generalisations about how hunter-gatherers of the recent past think of death. And Lewis Binford did this using the online global database for hunter-gatherer societies. And the point of Binford's work was that he noticed that one can break down the way that hunter-gatherers think of death, which tends to change the more sophisticated they become in terms of their social organization. So if you look at the bar chart on the left, this is all, I've just computed this from Binford's paper. In hunter-gatherer groups, which are to all intents and purposes egalitarian, you know, most of them feel, well, some of them feel that deaths are natural, you know, as we've seen, it comes to everyone, etc. But some of them feel that all deaths are unnatural. It's not humans' lot to die. But in the middle, it's the interesting thing here. Almost as many believe that deaths are natural in most cases, expected and so on, but accidents aren't. And also deaths are natural in most cases, except anything involving prime adults, infants I should have put on this, and prime adults in the prime of their life. And you can see from the bar charts on the right that this really starts to change when hunter-gatherers have a degree of ranking or stratification, or even a wealth-based accumulative system, where I've just put these red boxes to show the central two categories. In other words, the more socially complex hunter-gatherer groups are, the more they tend to believe that while most deaths are natural, it's not natural when accidents occur, those sudden deaths, and it's not natural when young, relatively young individuals, prime adults especially, die as well. So we might predict from this that as our Paleolithic social groups grow in complexity, as mortuary activity might be growing itself in complexity, but we might predict that actually attention to those accidental sudden deaths and the deaths of young adults and perhaps infants would attract relatively more attention. So we can just into good, to speak, however painful to watch, and those sudden unexpected bad deaths and so on. And this is something that Maurice Bloch and others have suggested are characteristics of ethnographically observed human societies, that, you know, really what humans want, if they can, is a degree of control over the process of death. And if they don't have control, if a leopard kills someone, for example, then that is bad. And this is what I think fundamentally might at least represent the continual thread, not a tipping point, of course, but the continual underlying thread throughout hominoid and hominin evolution. So I make three predictions from this. So, in other words, as the size of hominin groups grows, and we know if you buy into Robin Dunbar, etc., we know they probably do, one might expect too a growth in the complexity of mortuary activities. The longer amounts of time spent on them, and perhaps the more individuals preoccupied with them. So a simple prediction that the complexity of mortuary activity will grow as human groups do. Again, not necessarily a tipping point, of course, but perhaps a generic, general growth. But superimposed on that background, we might expect that if anything is going to elicit more attention, in other words, more, what's the word, be under selection for change, it would be those bad deaths in which these activities would be occasioned around more. But the major point, and this is where it does become a tipping point, I suggest, is that at some point you only have a certain amount of time in a foraging day to stand around talking about death and the dead and, you know, how terrible this is and so on. So this can't be a continual, everlasting process that we wind up with, you know, activity around a corpse that lasts several days and involves everyone, you know. So that would be my prediction is the point at which you need other ways to take over from that face-to-face attention to the corpse. In other words, you begin to use the landscape to commemorate, to take it on the return, you know, if that's not anachronistic. You know, a place becomes associated with a death or with death, and therefore it continues to be commemorated, which of course one doesn't when you just walk away from the corpse after face-to-face activities. So for me, that would be the first major tipping point. So I'm not going to elaborate on what I've suggested for funerary phases before. I've suggested that we go through this long phase of funerary caching, you know, like Cima de los Huesos, perhaps Homo naledi, even in the Dinaledi chamber and so on, you know, use of natural fissures and so on for disposal of corpses. That could be right, that might be wrong. João Zilao has very sensibly suggested that some of these activities could be, well, some of these situations could be accidental and so on. The point being, we don't have much evidence for it. Perhaps it's occasional, perhaps it just reflects odd groups doing this and that, not generic practices and so on. But the point is really, for me, it's when we start seeing changes in a far broader sense in human behaviour, well, by 100,000 years ago, perhaps somewhat earlier, that we have this major tipping point in place. And of course, it's tempting just to say, well, as soon as we have burials, Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, that we have this in place. But burials are just one part, I think, of what a far wider set of behaviours that provide the social complex for later. But I don't want to go into that. But what strikes me, and this is from the work of Francesco, of others in Bordeaux, of João and colleagues across Europe, that we can see with Neanderthals a number of behavioural changes that distinguish them, say, from early Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis, and so on. And it seems to me this is all focused on the individual body, you know, the use of ornamentation, pigments as colorants, and I hope you believe our dating in 3 caves in Spain, and the projection of parts of the individual body onto the external landscape, either in the form of hand stencils. There's one from one of a number, several dozen, from Maltreviejo cave in Extremadura, or as finger dots, as we see here from La Pasiega, just the rectilinear design, which has been created by covering the tip of the finger with pigment, and they've been pressed onto the wall. The later, the more curvilinear designs are much later, probably of the cave's Solution art. And also, of course, in the washes applied of red pigment to largely to the folds, the concavities of stalactite flows in Ardalef cave in the south. But what strikes me as interesting is that Neanderthals are ornamenting their bodies, they're colouring, presumably, their bodies, they're extending parts of their bodies to the external landscape, and on occasion, they're burying those bodies as well. And however we might debate about whether we have lots of examples of Neanderthal burials or whether we have relatively few, and of course, Bruno and others have been at the forefront of demonstrating how reliably some Neanderthals can be said to bury some of their dead some of the time. You know, regardless of how we debate about that, there is, I think, undeniably an interest in the social body among Neanderthals, both in life, of course, but occasionally, at least, in death too. And to borrow the terms from psychologists, this is behaviour that's transitioning from behaviour in the here and now, focused on the body, and anything that's reachable at arm's length, in other words, peripersonal behaviour, to a use, however simplistic, of the external landscape, of creating things you can step back and look at or revisit and so on, or extrapersonal, which if you accept, I hope our minimum ages for this art would occur at least before 64,000 years ago. So coming back to this, by the way, I've got a number of slides for the discussion, examples and this sort of thing, but I thought you'd fall asleep and you'll know it all anyway, so I'm not going to go through them now. So I'll bring it to a conclusion, and we can open up the discussion, of course. So here's my general transition throughout the animal kingdom, from that simplest chemical stage to our cultural elaboration on these here. And I don't see much evidence that we can really say that these are tipping points. For me, this is a gradual, partial, and in often cases reversible, perhaps in an evolutionary scale, set of processes. But I'd suggest that we can recognize two tipping points. So my answer to the question I set is yes, perhaps there are two tipping points that would be worthy of further investigation. The first is that transition from face-to-face to place. So the beginnings of the use of the landscape, in this case, of course, to commemorate or dispose of the dead. And it's difficult to see how a social group of a certain number of individuals or of a certain type of cognitive complexity could then revert back to a more chimpanzee-like face-to-face, or even simple funerary caching, if you buy, perhaps call this the hominin tipping point. And I would see that as having occurred certainly with funerary caching from, say, 500,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, if you buy those arguments, or by the time Neanderthals and their contemporaries are at least burying some of their dead some of the time. But somewhat closely linked, or perhaps coming a little while later, would be what we probably can see as a second tipping point, and that is with the culturalization of beliefs that rationalize, explain, and attempt to do away with the notion that we're all going to die and that's it, and so on. And again, it seems to me that once we arrive at these minimally counterintuitive concepts that become so entrenched, that give us things to think with, to communicate with, and so on, it would be pretty impossible to go back from them as well. So perhaps we can see that the origins of belief and so on, including mortuary, as part of a cultural tipping point, if you like. As to where that would be placed, well, I think we can certainly say, from a European perspective, perhaps the early mid-Upper Paleolithic, the early Gravettian, because not only of the funerary evidence we have, which is very selective towards bad deaths typically, but what appear to, in my opinion, to be linked, like the disposal of Venus figurines and so on. But perhaps we should look more broadly into the earliest Upper Paleolithic, the later, the Middle Paleolithic. I don't really have an answer for that, but my mind is very much open to that too. So a long, gradual process throughout the animal kingdom, becoming social with our hominoid ancestors, but those two tipping points occurring in the large-brained hominins, taking us really into a recognizably human funerary realm would be my answer. And there's Il Principe raising a glass of Bordeaux claret to you all. I wish I could be there in person with you, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. It was a really wonderful talk. And I'm sure that there are some of the colleagues attending the talk that would like to ask questions. Otherwise, I will have one or two questions, but of course, I will be the last. So anyone who has been seduced by Paul's ideas and predictions?
Yeah, very nice talk, Paul. Thank you very much. And I would like you to give us a little bit more your idea, but why don't you consider that the first primary burials could be an important tipping point in the evolution of the mortuary activities, and not completely related to what you told us about the fact that it is a kind of the use of the landscape, and the important point could be the place more than the burial.
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing I'd note about burials is that not everyone is doing it to everyone, everywhere, as soon as they appear. You know, despite excavations aplenty and great faunal preservation, etc., they still are relatively rare, and of course are geographically, as you know, are specific to very specific groups. So I would never want to say that Neanderthals buried their dead. I mean, in a formal sense, some Neanderthals buried some of their dead some of the time. It was big in France, big in Israel, you know, and this kind of thing. Now, that could be very important, and the tipping point could have been very important and focused on burial in those specific groups. But I wouldn't want to generalize that perhaps there's a broad species level tipping point there too. So for me, I wouldn't necessarily say it was burial per se that's the tipping point. It's very much the practice of burial and its wider context, which is a social tipping point. And that comes on to what you suggest about the actual use of specific sites. So in some cases, we can tell La Ferrazie, for example, that they are returning to these sites at least several times as well. So I would say that whatever you're doing with the dead, the fact that you are using specific parts of the landscape in that mortuary behaviour is the important thing.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, second part of my idea could be, what do you think that we could try to do to demonstrate the existence or the potential existence of secondary funerary activities before the, I would say, the isotopic stage of 5 or 4 in the Homo sapiens or Heidelbergensis populations?
Yeah, sorry, are you asking how I might suggest we can recognize this?
Yeah, exactly, because considering what you told us, and I am fully agree with you, with the idea that there is a kind of more and more important complexity of the funerary activities related to the organization of the society, it seems to me that considering at least European sites and so on, there were some secondary funerary activities which could explain the fact that we have discovered many isolated skulls in within the archaeological fillings of sites related to isotopic stage 7 or 6, and that this could represent secondary funerary activities related to these hominid groups.
Yes, absolutely. I think perhaps Homo naledi would be a good example of this. It is that these patterns of very selective skeletal representation could, on occasion, be an example of, as you say, secondary funerary activities, for sure. I'm not fully convinced yet about the hominid material. Some of them are articulated, but they're body parts. They're articulated, the odd leg and the odd arm and this kind of thing. So if they're curating anything into that cave, it's limbs. But I'm not fully convinced that the team have really eliminated the possibility of some kind of low energy transport there. But I think that would be in the context of funerary caching sites. I'd expect that well understood depositional factors, if we can control for all of that, and also the specific body parts, crania, skulls, as you say, that would be a particularly good indicator of something that's more than simple association of the dead with certain sites. I think it would have to be underpinned by some kind of belief system, however simple, you know, carrying around your mother's head or something like that, you know. So that's the only way I can really think of these, aside from or in combination with cut marks, which of course, as you know, we have, if not abundant evidence of cut marks, they crop up from time and time again, from Australopithecines right through to Homo sapiens. In many cases, of course, it can be other cases mysterious, and you might not necessarily expect any firm delineation between the two. But yeah, so modifications, of course, selective curation of skeletal parts into particular sites where we can rule out other depositional factors and so on, I think would do it.
I would have two questions about the chimps. I'm not a specialist in thanatology, but I was thinking two things. I was really interested by the idea that you mentioned about the concept of memory associated with basically the dead individual. And was there any observation, for example, in the Thai chimp, that after, for example, an infant was dead and carried by the mother for almost 2 months, there would be an association between the event of death and the actual place or the circumstances, and would, for example, the mother come back to that place as, you know, not a use of landscape, but like a mental recognition of the place of death? Would that happen after she stopped carrying the baby?
I can answer that in two ways, good news and bad news. So the good news is I would predict it, because of course chimpanzees recognize specific places, return to them, mark them with sound even, as we know, and so on. So I would expect that. But the bad news is, of course, there's absolutely no observations as yet to this, because, and they're minimal times for curation, because the observer, the primatologist, just happens to, you know, get up one day and a mother is carrying her dead infant, so they don't know how long, they don't know where the infant died and under what circumstances, and so on. The good thing is now primatologists are increasingly more interested in death. You know, so and as you know, Bill McGrew admitted, you know, nobody ever really thought about it. They were interested, understandably, in living chimpanzees, living primates, and so on. So I'm sure that that kind of information will become available, you know, and there's a good half a dozen primatologists really interested in research now. So we will find that. There is one piece of evidence, as yet unpublished. A Chinese primatologist researching, it's a type of monkey, and I forget, like the sort of comical looking sun-faced monkey or something like that. Anyway, he recorded a mother whose infant died at an open air site, but a site in which there are some rock fissures, just little ones, and the mother took the infant's body into the little fissure, left it there, and kept going out foraging and returning to that fissure as well. And an absolutely fascinating example, perhaps, of how caching might actually occur. So maybe that's what we have to think about Homo naledi and so on. So yeah, so it's not a great answer, but you know, I'm sure we can really expect that there and predict that there will be, you know, some kind of repetitive interest in death science. Yeah.
If I can afford a second question.
Please.
I had read the paper, I can't remember the author's name, but about also like a kind of mortuary cleaning of the body in chimps, especially using a kind of twig, a little piece of wood, and cleaning in between the teeth. And so my provocative question would be, how would you interpret that? Why would the chimpanzee care about their dead being cleaned once they are dead and not using their teeth anymore?
Yeah, I think in that sense, it is part of the package of grooming, and that is part of the package of coming to terms with why this individual is no longer moving and so on. So of course, I'm sure the chimpanzees aren't thinking, well, we can't leave them with unclean teeth and you know, this sort of things. Like one of our cats just constantly wants attention from me, not because she needs you know, cleaning or whatever, but because a lot can be explained for this kind of behavior too. And I think a lot of the stuff modern humans do around the dead is unthinking, you know. The way people will tend to be quiet, silent, or speak in very hushed tones, things that don't really have any logical reason behind them, but that we all do generally. So I think that that's how I would interpret that, in no different a way of, you know, brushing them down and and this kind of thing. Yeah, the one thing, just to go back to your first question, that's just occurred to me, what is a very common observation among chimpanzees is that, I have to get this the right way round, yeah, when chimpanzees are injured and they have wounds that are bleeding, they will usually lick those wounds. Partially it's presumably, you know, to clean and so on, but it seems to be investigative as well. But when similar wounds have led to the death of individuals, they don't actually lick them. It's almost as if they are categorically making a distinction between the blood of the dead and the blood of the living, and this kind of thing. That just goes back to the fact that I would predict that if they're making associations like that, and they lick blood on the floor of injury sites as well, so it's almost forensic investigation. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were far broader, you know, associations of death sites and so on.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Otherwise, I have a question, which perhaps is also on the behalf of some of the people who listen to you, which is the way in which you articulate the tipping point that you identified and some evolutionary step that you present in your slide. So the chemistry, emotion, society, cultural belief, cultural ecology belief, these are not really tipping point. I would say evolutionary step that you consider that in fact you may find some way back on those. So that's lead to the first question is what are the criteria that you would present to identify the, let's say, the transition between cultural belief and cultural ecology belief, and how this is linked to possible tipping point. So is a bit theoretical, but in a sense, people I think is interested in knowing how you make this distinction and why some are irreversible and some may be reversible.
Yes, absolutely, and that's the key, of course. If I go back to this, so as you say, I see pretty much all of this as just transitional, potentially reversible, and so on. In other words, not a series of tipping points. But what I would argue is that if I'm right in thinking that the social changes behind the beginnings of the use of the external landscape, either in a funerary or in another form, have increased to the complexity, to the size and complexity that requires this, then I find it difficult to see how one could step back from that. So in other words, when hominins are living in groups that are large relative to the primate norm, and we might say Heidelberg, we might say Middle Pleistocene, say, and the ways of dealing with these larger numbers of people, perhaps slightly more complex relations of inequality between them and so on, it seems to me that if the body has become an important part of the way the body is commemorated in the context of the landscape, if that becomes an important part of social negotiation, I find it difficult to see how one could go back from that, at least at a societal level. Okay, small groups can go off and, you know, don't perhaps have that any further. Perhaps the very obvious point becomes a tipping point, the reversibility, would be the late Pleistocene, circum-Mediterranean with cemeteries, when the dead are becoming sedentary in the same way as the late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers, you know. So that I would certainly see as being a tipping point. The cemetery, the social worlds of the dead, tipping point. But the question would be, can we put it back, you know, into the upper Pleistocene and so on? For me, and I suppose this is the typical way that we have to work as paleoanthropologists, everything kind of adds. I don't want to sound all Paul Mellars and say it's not a coincidence that Neanderthals are interested in elaborating their bodies, painting things, extending bits of their bodies into art and burying some of them. But, you know, it seems to me that there's something else behind that. And of course, early Homo sapiens expressed in different ways too. So all I can say really is, I suppose the job, not my job to convince you, would be to try to show why that is irreversible, you know. And all I can do is say, well, you know, once you start wearing clothing and looking good and assuaging all of your anxieties in these ways, I'd find it very odd if they did, you know.
That is a very inspiring answer. Though we of course we lack a part of the evidence, but we need idea. We need ideas, and you are providing, and they provided us a lot of ideas today. So do we have still question for Paul?
Can I have one more?
Please, please.
Okay, Paul, maybe it could be quite a little bit surprising question. I would like to know if you have an explanation on the fact that even if we have tried to produce more scientific data related to Neanderthal burials, and I am thinking to our work on La Chapelle-Aussin, why do we have some colleagues, scientific colleagues, great colleagues who are doing very interesting field works, who are still unable to accept the hypothesis that some Neanderthals have buried some of their dead?
Yeah, you're asking why can some of our colleagues have difficulty?
Exactly.
Oh, don't get me started. Why do they have difficulty accepting that Neanderthals can just extend some pigments to a cave wall as well? My explanation for this inability is that some colleagues operate in a very simplistic paradigm, that Neanderthals are stupid, or were stupid, I should say, and Homo sapiens are the epitome of cognitive brilliance and so on, and therefore they, without thinking, write it off. I think Robert Gargett did a very good job in challenging our assumptions. I don't think he did it convincingly, and obviously your work at La Chapelle and up Shanidar, of course, has really shown that now we can really excavate sites very well, you know, that this is unambiguous and so on. The problem is, I think a lot of these people don't really read papers critically. They don't read them in an open-minded way. They certainly don't read anything called supplementary information, you know, and this is the way that the community often works, you know. So I mean, the amount of people who write off my questioning of the age of Chauvet's art, for example, have never read any of my comments on it or anything like that. And of course, all of the people who say, and this is a good one, and I will quote Randall White et al., 42 authors criticizing this very notion that Neanderthals could produce cave art, and they say, in over 100 years of research, we have no evidence of Neanderthal cave art. Therefore, you know, I mean, for much of human history, we didn't have a concept of the Neolithic or the Ice Age. It doesn't mean to say they don't exist, you know. And I think there is that is a fundamental paradigmatic flaw of people for whom, whether they, you know, whether as racist to go about assuming Neanderthals were stupid and so on or not, it just seems to me it's a blasé. It's not a scientific, it's not an open-minded view. So, and how they can, if they bother to read your publications on La Chapelle and others, and they bother to read the fine detail, they should come away from it totally convinced that this is the case. And the final point, I think, is that there is this tendency to generalize in terms of black or white. Neanderthals buried their dead, or they didn't bury their dead, you know, rather than nuancing it, you know. So we can't say chimpanzees use stones to crack nuts, you know, some do, some don't, etc. And it seems to me, as an archaeologist interested in behavior, the more we nuance things, the more exciting the Paleolithic becomes, you know. And just because Neanderthals didn't bury all of their dead doesn't make them pretty stupid, far from it. That's a long-winded random way to answer that question, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Since we also have some postdoc and doctoral student here, we can take this call as an invitation to being open-minded in their work. Since often for us, we are too old to be open-minded, but they are young and they may be, we hope, more open-minded than us. So I see that I don't see anybody ready for asking more questions. So it was already a very interesting exchange on some key issues. And of course, the tipping point that you identified and that we may perhaps work on them in discussion. So it was really a very stimulating talk. And on behalf of all the attendants and all the members of the GPR, unfortunately, some of them could not be present because they were teaching this afternoon. But so it was really nice. So thank you again on the behalf of all of us for this thoughtful talk. And we hope to be, I mean, we will be again in a few days together, although online, but we certainly have to find other opportunities. Perhaps with you coming to Bordeaux as we planned.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you all. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak at such an august institution, and thanks for all your friendliness as well.
So it's extremely difficult to open a good Bordeaux wine online. So we keep that action. It's an irreversible tipping point for when you will come here.
Yes, a tipping point in that sense. So, I very much look forward to it. That would be lovely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.